Hey, thanks for watching this video. I want to give you a brief introduction to some of the things that you're about to see in worldview, ethics, and society. The first thing we want to cover is everyone has a worldview. Everyone, in a sense, is religious. In other words, they hold views that cannot be proven. And so whether you are an atheist, you have beliefs that cannot be proven. If you are a Christian or a Buddhist, same thing for you. And those beliefs help shape your worldview. And the goal of a worldview, in theory, is to match reality, the views that you hold personally, and help you interpret and see the world around you, and the issues and policies and social situations. You hope they're based in reality. You hope that you are seeing things correctly. But we all have to recognize that there's part of our worldview that may not match reality, which is why we should always be open to being corrected, to learning something new, to taking on a new vantage point and perspective so that we can learn from that. This topic is helpful because it goes deeper into why people believe what they believe. How you view the world, the way it is, influences how you think the world should be. It impacts your values in voting, whether a utopian society is possible, and mankind's issues and how to resolve them. Your worldview impacts how you view each of those things. The foundational beliefs of your worldview determines the ideals and behaviors of your life. This is true for society as well. So as a society, those foundational beliefs that the majority share result in the fruit of the actions that we see. Now, in this video, you're going to see him contrast atheistic worldviews, naturalism, to theistic worldviews. This applies to politics and religion more than you would think. Now, to tie this back to politics and government, our values are either compatible with the way God designed the world to work, or they don't. We see practical outcomes either way. Some are good, some are bad. As America becomes more secular, we will see more negative consequences impact society, such as broken families, not living according to God's plan for the family, crime, a common result of broken homes or poverty, and a lot less tolerance of opposing viewpoints. This also ties back to apologetics by looking at the value of human life, the principle of private property and personal responsibility, the need to help the poor, the goal of enriching marriages, and the outcomes of biblical morals. I hope you enjoyed today's video and that it gets you thinking about what your worldview is and how you think the world should be.
And I'm an engineering professor, but I'm really interested, passionate in the idea of worldview and why you think the way you do. I'm not a philosophy professor, but I guess I like to play in that or something. I don't know, but I'm really concerned that people have especially if people are going to have a biblical worldview, they really understand why that's a consistent worldview and how it compares to other worldviews. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is really just the basic idea of what a worldview is first, and what that means, and the fact that all of us really have one. And quite frankly, I'm going to propose that everyone has a religious view. Even if you claim to be an atheist, you've made a religious choice. You're going to have a God one way or the other, whether it's yourself, something else, or who we believe is the transcendent God that's pre-existent, eternal. You're going to have a God one way or the other that's going to guide your life. So I want to talk a little bit about that first, and then I want to then talk a little bit about how two extreme worldviews, naturalism and basically a biblical theistic worldview, what the outcomes with those two would be in a specific application. So let me talk a little bit first. And I'm a professor. I like to use my hands. I can't just stand here and talk. I have to have slides and do this. So, and I welcome if you want to say something or ask something. But for example, where do we get our information? Where do you get your information at? What types of sources? Books, media. We got books, surfing the web, the news. It's kind of interesting. Our news has really become, I think, more and more entertainment than real news. Our pastor went up to visit his brother in Seattle last week, and he said it was really interesting to watch Canadian news because he said it was real news. It wasn't just, fluff and everything. They really talked about issues, and I think that's kind of interesting. So, and the issue is, compared to people 400 years ago, supposedly, we get more information in a day than they got their whole life 400 years ago. So, I mean, we've got this information glut. And I think what we have to keep in mind is we're getting this information from all kinds of sources, and we have to be discerning. Because, basically information isn't neutral. It consists of ideas, and ideas have consequences. And I've got two examples, two extremes here. Does anybody know who this is right here? It's Marx, okay? And this is the Declaration of Independence. Two extremely different views based on ideas. Two extremely different outcomes based on ideas. Both of them had an idea, and there's two very different outcomes from that. So ideas have definite consequences. So we need to think about what ideas we're being exposed to, ideologies, ideas, whatever you want to call it, and we need to be discerning. What are they really saying? And what are the implications of that? So what we need to be is, like I said, in this information glut, we need to be discerning. And discerning has really three pieces. We need to be able to detect. We need to be watching and thinking, looking at what is coming at us and where it's coming from. And then we need to take that information and kind of define it. What is it really saying? And then we need to discriminate and say, is that something I want to accept or not? I mean, you need to be aware of what's going on, not just blindly walking through life. You need to define what you're really coming across. What is this thing I'm being told? And is it a good thing or not? Now, the problem with that is, how do you determine if something's a good thing or not? Is it good or evil? Is it right or wrong? How do you determine that? Well, you need a standard to determine that, right? To really say that. It may be your own feelings at the time, or there may be some other set of rules or beliefs that you follow. So your worldview is really this basis of discrimination. That's whether you realize you have one or not, you do. And that's really how you choose right and wrong, acceptable, not acceptable, in your beliefs. You base them on this worldview. And everyone has one. A 2-year-old thinks they're the center of the universe. Whatever happens ought to revolve around me. I'm God, in a sense, at that point. A secular humanist believes the material world is all that exists. There's nothing outside of what we see, feel, taste, touch, whatever. There's nothing spiritual. There's nothing transcendent outside. A Hindu would basically believe that this whole physical world's just an illusion, that it's not even real. And that's kind of interesting. It actually has very interesting implications for science. If you ever look at Hindu or Eastern cultures that have kind of transcendentalist type beliefs, they really weren't that strong in science at some point, because why would you study something that isn't real? Why would you study an illusion? And there's no reason to. So why would you do that? So it even impacted how they approached science and things that were in the physical world, because they didn't believe they were real. And they believed you want to escape this. Whereas a person that has a true biblical worldview would actually first say that we're created by God for a purpose, and our purpose is to love Him and to serve Him by doing good works. I'll talk about that later. And so, very different set of worldviews. Now, this definition comes from a guy named, I got this from John Stonestreet. I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with Summit Ministries, but a lot of this information, some of this material I got from him. So, basically, kind of a basic definition of worldview is the framework of our most basic beliefs. Some people would call those religious beliefs. Your most foundational beliefs are what you call religious. Even if you don't believe in a God, they're the same idea as someone that does. It's a religious foundational premise. It shapes our view of and for the world, and is the basis of our decisions and actions. Okay? And I'm going to use 3 examples to kind of say what a worldview is like. One is lenses, glasses. The way you view the world, like you do through glasses, is one way to think of a worldview. Another way is a map. And the third way is a puzzle, okay? So the first thing, worldview glasses. One of the ways to think of a worldview is this basic set of principles that, for example, when I pull these glasses off, y'all are kind of fuzzy. But when I put them on, I see you more clearly. Hopefully they're good enough to do that. Well, that's really what your worldview is. It's what you look through to interpret the world, to make sense of it in a way. That's really what your worldview is. And so there's a lot of worldviews out there. There's people that would have a scientific worldview. Everything's judged based on, again, kind of this materialistic, what would science say? What can I feel, touch, smell, sense? That kind of thing. There's a lot of people that judge the world on how much I can make out of it, what kind of money I can make off of this. Is this a good thing financially or not? A lot of people have that as their basic worldview lens. There's obviously religious lenses. Right now there's a lot of things in the paper about radical Islam, at least if nothing else, you know, talking about radical Islam, at least if nothing else, you know, talking about whether you say it's a distortion or not of actual Islam, that's a very strong lens that people see the world through. It's obviously more of like a Christian worldview, and there's even some worldviews that say there's all kinds of religions and I can see everything through all of them. There's really not it's a mismatch of everything. That's a very common, that would be like a Baha'i faith, for example, from a religious standpoint, that all of them have truth and so forth. So, but what in reality is, these really are more like contacts. And the reason that we say this is because I have glasses, I know I have them on, but I'm wearing contacts. A lot of times I forget I'm wearing them. But I still have this worldview even if I don't think about the fact that I have it. So it's really a lot more like these lenses, that more like contacts, where you may not remember you're seeing things this way, but you are. So you can think of this worldview idea as a set of glasses or contacts through which you view and make sense of the world. Now, a view of the world. Everybody knows what this is here, right? World Trade Center. I actually, almost a year ago, not quite, my wife and I went up to New York and we went down to Ground Zero. It's a very moving experience when you consider what happened there. And back on September 11th, the other day, I was watching one of the channels, NBC or somebody, replayed like the original news, and it was very, very sombering, I guess. But let's look at what your worldview does here. Is the way we interpret events is based on what our worldview is, what our foundational beliefs are. Let me show you some examples. Everybody know who this guy is? You know who that is? Jerry Falwell. You know who that is? Even if I tell you who that is, looks a little bit like Boss Hogg. Nowadays he's dead now. He was one of the heads of what was called the Moral Majority. Have y'all heard of the Moral Majority? That was a movement of Christians, but it was a very intricately tied with political power, if in a way, now, even though they had good principles or good reasons. Well, his interpretation of this event was that God was punishing the United States for our sin. That was his basic statement. This was the punishment of God on us. Now, let me ask you this question. Who's that guy? Osama bin Laden. You know what he said about this event? God's punishment on the United States, the great Satan. That was his same statement, even though he came from a totally different worldview. That was still his conclusion he made from that worldview. Okay? This guy, he was an Episcopal or an Anglican priest who basically said this event made him decide there was no God, because his worldview was such that he couldn't handle a God that wasn't big enough to handle bad things, that big things couldn't happen in his worldview. And that's actually one of the big problems with people accepting the idea of a Christian God, actually, is because when there are bad things, how could a good God let that happen? Now, you can talk about that. That's a whole other discussion, but that's one of the things that people have to deal with. This lady here, it wasn't this exact lady. I just found somebody that I thought kind of fit the profile a little bit. But this was a true statement. I don't know why. I didn't mean that derogatory. I just did. But she said something like, "Oh, it was bad karma. That's why we had this happen. It was bad karma." She had this transcendental type worldview. So that's why this happened. So basically, your worldview is going to be the thing you interpret world events through, too. Whatever you have as foundational beliefs are going to be how you interpret what happens around you. So worldview is like these glasses. You can also think of it as a map. Now a map basically tells you how to get, one way you use it is to get to a location, right? If you want to go somewhere, you use the map to get there. So consider what each of the following would be saying about where we're going in life, if you will, and how we're going to get there. UAH professor. Well, depending on the department, you probably are going to get a pretty wide variation on what's our ultimate goal and how we're getting there. And you could, from a Christian perspective, we'd be talking about, okay, what's going to happen in eternity. But you could even be talking about how are we going to get to a just society? How are we going to get to a utopia or something? I mean, it could even be like a political objective or a government objective. And the UAH professor, depending on who you talk to, would be very different than, say, a Baptist pastor. They might have a very different worldview. Or a Buddhist might have a very different worldview in terms of where we're going and how we're getting there. Now, all of them have a worldview that's like a map that they're using to kind of guide them to where they're going. Okay? Now, every worldview is this map. Now, I've been to Germany several times, and I have a really nice map from Germany, from Berlin. Now, I really like this map. I love this map. I studied the map. But if I want to use that to go around New York City, is that going to be very helpful? If I've got the wrong map for where I'm trying to get, I'm going to be in trouble, right? Well, if your worldview is not good or correct for where you're wanting to go, you're not going to get in the right end point. You're not going to go to the right point. So we have to be very careful thinking about what our worldview is, what is our objective, and are we using the right map to get there, the right set of basic beliefs. So not all maps are going to lead to the same destination, and do we really have the right map for what we're trying to do? That's a question to kind of ask. But your worldview is this map, how you're trying to get to a destination, even if it's the wrong map. Now, this is actually kind of where we're at today in what I'd call the postmodern time. You've heard that word postmodern. Basically, it actually comes out of an idea that it came out of Nietzsche was one of the people, I guess, but basically toward the end of the 1800s, right before the 1900s, right before the 20th century, there was this big idea of progress, and we were going to go to this great utopian future. And what happened right off the bat at the very first part, it was actually called the modern age at that time. But what actually happened is right about the first at least 20-something years of 1900, what kinds of things happened? One of the biggest things that happened right around 1915 to 20, World War I, massive destruction, many people killed. This time when, supposedly we've reached this new utopian society. And we had the Depression in the United States. Then we had World War II. World War I was the war to end all wars. And then we had World War II. And one of the biggest things in World War II, what do you think is one of the biggest technological events that was part of World War II? The atom bomb, exactly right. Now think about that. We can use nuclear energy, but what a weapon of destruction that came out of the modern thinking of man. So what happened is there was a large group of people that said, well, this idea of modernism is crazy. We're really in this postmodern society where we don't see a utopia. And in fact, we don't even think there's anything good about man, basically. And that's what kind of led into this idea of postmodernism. But one way to look at it today is a lot of people really just don't care. Every result, every belief, all they have equal value, doesn't really matter. Who cares? And it's kind of this quote out of Alice in Wonderland. If you don't know where you want to go, then it doesn't really matter which direction you travel. If you really don't care, it ain't going to matter how you get there, right? And this is, y'all know who Václav Havel is? Y'all are all you're not young, but you're fairly young. He was a Czech playwright who became the president of the Czech Republic after the Soviet Union broke apart and you had Czechoslovakia freed and it broke into Slovakia and the Czech Republic and things. He was the president. He was a playwright and a dissident under the Russians. And the tragedy of modern man is not that he knows less and less about the meaning of his own life, but it bothers him less and less. Who cares? I don't really care about my life. And that's not an unusual thought for a lot of people, a lot of youth especially today. They, some cases they may say that and not really believe it, but in some ways they act like it. Maybe it doesn't really matter. Or maybe it's not important to decide what ideas are true or not. Now, let me ask you this question. How do you solve a puzzle? I've actually given you some examples. My mother-in-law, at Christmas, I always buy her a puzzle because she really likes doing puzzles, and it's something we can set and do and I buy these 1,000-piece. They're not huge, but they're challenging at least enough, so we set and do puzzles. Well, you could do a lot of things. I like to find the straight edge part. Find all the edges and do that. I like that part. You definitely want to turn all the pieces up where you can see the color, not the backside, right? Some people throw away pieces, and we'll end up every now and then finding a piece missing. It's on the floor or something, or we're sitting on it or something. And some people will take a pair of scissors, cut them up, and jam them in however they go. I've actually jammed in pieces that didn't really go either, but I didn't cut them, but I jammed them in. But if you really want to get quickly or more quickly to this end result, what do? What's the best thing you could do? You got a puzzle. You look at the box top because there's the picture, hopefully, unless somebody's playing a trick on you. And I've thought about doing that before, quite frankly. I've thought about giving somebody a puzzle with the wrong picture and watching them for a while until they find out. But that's pretty mean, isn't it? So
You buy two puzzles and just swap the top.
I may do that to my mother-in-law this year. I don't know. We'll see. I do like her, though. But you look at the box top. Basically, what you do is you go look at the top, and the top gives you a guide to what the final picture is going to look like. Well, if you think about it, that's really kind of like a worldview, too. A worldview is that picture that you hold up to say, how should your life be? How should your government be? How should your life be? How should this institution be? It's that worldview. What is a well-ordered society? It's that worldview that tells you that, those fundamental principles. So basically, I like this picture of a world that's made out of little puzzle pieces. In this statement, human life is far more complicated than a 1,000-piece puzzle, but it certainly needs to be lived with a picture in mind of what life is all about. Because otherwise, you're just going to have a bunch of pieces, and they're not going to be connected properly. They're not going to be functioning properly. So the worldview is like this box top. What should it look like? Doesn't mean we always get to that objective, but at least we have that guide of what it should be like. Okay, and this is another thing from Stone Street, this idea that basically our worldview is how we set our values, and our values are going to be what we base our behavior on. And what his belief is that we've really inverted things in some way. We start with this kind of behaviors and somehow lead to values to worldview or something. When things are inverted, they're upside down. But really this worldview should be foundational. I like this too. This is out of another thing from him and another couple of people. To think of this kind of idea that the roots down here of a tree are basically your inner basic beliefs. Theology, what you think about God, and philosophy about what you think the nature of reality is. And those are basically the roots that this tree grows out of. And so everything in society, the outward behavior, our ethics, law, history, government, psychology, sociology, science, economics, are the fruit that comes out of the roots of this foundational belief system. Okay? So these inner beliefs, what we bear as fruit depends a lot on this part. So if we have a very different root system, we're going to have different fruit. Okay? I like this biblical verse, Matthew 7:20. It's talking about Christians. Actually Christians and non-Christians, depending on the context or what part you're reading, but thus by their fruit you will recognize them. Well, I'd say the same thing about society. The fruits of our society are one of the ways you recognize what kind of society is, what their basic beliefs are about the fruit they produce. So it's something to think about. Are we producing good fruit? Okay, another way to look at this when you're considering worldviews is these kind of ultimate questions. And depending on if you read this kind of stuff, you'll see people that'll have 4 questions. Some may have even more. I like this 5, this breakdown. It's really kind of 6, but the top one, these are details under the top one. But the first main question is, what's ultimate reality? And really what you're saying is, what do I think about the world I see, and is there God or not? Or what is God? Okay, that might be the way to say it. Who or what is my God? And then as part of that, it's going to be these questions of origins. Where did everything come from? That's one way to look at that worldview, is what do you believe about where everything around us, including people, came from? Is there a meaning or purpose to life? Okay, that's an important question. What's our destiny? What's going to happen to us after we die? That's part of your worldview, what you believe about that. I actually kind of flip these. We're going to talk about ethics and morality. Is there a right and wrong, and who decides? And then a lot of that is going to lead to identity, and that's really, what do we think a human being is? What's a person? That's what we're going to talk a little more about. This is an interesting quote. Everybody knows who H.G. Wells is, right? Science fiction writer. This is something, I don't necessarily think he was saying this because he believed in God per se, but he realized that this is an important question. If there is no God, nothing matters. If there is a God, nothing else matters. What you believe is your God. This is Stone Street. A belief about God is a belief about everything. That is very foundational to everything else we do, is what we think about, is there a God, or who is our God? Again, I think is really the way we need to think about that. Who or what is our God? This lady, Nancy Pearcey, I don't know if you've ever heard of her. She wrote this book called Total Truth. She was a disciple, is probably not the right word, but a follower and student of a guy named Francis Schaeffer. You know, I've ever heard of Francis Schaeffer, the philosopher. Really interesting guy. I don't even claim to be anything like him. He's a real philosopher, but he was very good in the late 60s. One of his big things was he was a Christian, but it was to go out and really interact with people where they were at and talk to them about everyday life. And he was really interested in culture and art and kind of what we were seeing as symptoms of our society and the type of art. You know, postmodern art is kind of part of this idea of this desperation of of the world, and so they just started creating this fanciful, crazy stuff, things that had all these disjointed images and stuff. Kind of came out of that desperation that there's really no meaning to life, is really where we got a lot of the postmodernism. But she says what I was trying to claim is all worldviews are religious. The overriding factor in the choices we make is our ultimate belief or religious commitment. Our lives are shaped by the God, little God we worship, whether the God of the Bible or some substitute deity. It could be me, could be what my friends think, could be all kinds of other things. Or it could be a God that's this transcendent being. Okay, so let's look real quickly at what I want to do here is compare two what I think are extreme worldviews. One is naturalism, and one is what I'd call biblical theism. Christianity is really what I'm going to profess, but let's look at the differences. Naturalism, when you think about reality, what exists, think of this box, and basically what naturalism would say is that nature's all that exists. So the world we see, energy, matter, but basically what we can see, touch, measure, that kind of stuff, that's all that exists. It basically would preclude supernatural. Now granted, you got physicists talking about there's other dimensions and things.
It's kind of like objective or subjective.
It's basically, well, yeah, it has nothing to do with feelings. There's absolutely only material, energy, very set rules, that kind of thing. This is kind of who, I don't know if y'all know this guy. Have any of y'all ever heard of Carl Sagan? He was very, he had this famous thing of billions and billions of stars or something. He had this kind of funny, I talk funny too, but he had this kind of funny lisp kind of thing. But he wrote a book called Cosmos. The cosmos is all that is or ever was or ever will be. So in his mind, the cosmos is what?
God.
That's God. Cosmos is God, that just this grand unit, and it's not even a sentient being, it's just, that's God, if you will. That's all that exists, that's all reality is. Now, let's contrast that with biblical theism. Okay? Now, this is an image of God based on the revelation of the Bible. Whether you believe in the Bible or not, that's what this image is, that's where it comes from. But the Bible says that we both know there is a God from just seeing nature, but then by having Scripture, we have a more specific description of His character. Again, whether you believe in it or not, I'm just saying this is what the Bible says. So, what we have in the Bible is that there was this eternal pre-existent God that's been always existed. And these are a couple of verses. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God was already there. Psalm 92 is something where it says from everlasting to everlasting. Basically, He was already there. Now, what God did, according to biblical theism, is He acted to create reality. He created everything we see, the natural world and a supernatural spiritual world. He created too. I mean, just based on what the Bible says. So, there's natural and spiritual. Okay? So that's things like they were all created by God, they're sustained by God. It includes things, angels, demons, human soul. Humans have a soul, we have a free will, we have immortality according to the Bible. One of the things I'm trying to show here too is unlike naturalism where the box is closed and all you have is what's in the box, here in this idea of biblical theism is God's outside of the created nature. He acts within it, but He's outside. He's not part of it. See, now transcendentalism, I left that out. It's kind of in between. It's kind of the extreme. You have naturalism that only what you can see, touch, smell. Transcendentalism is the whole universe is God. There was this transcendent thing. It's not a being out there that we came from and are going to. Biblical theism says there's this being God that pre-existed, created the world for some reason, and then acts in it still. Now, deism is that He doesn't act in it. He just made the box and leaves it alone. Christian theism, biblical theism, is that He acts within it. And in fact, it goes even further. He actually revealed Himself as Jesus Christ on earth. And Jesus claimed to be God Himself. So that's the model of biblical theism versus naturalism. Now, let's look at a couple of things. Naturalism and origins. What does naturalism say about this question of origins? Y'all know who Stephen Jay Gould is? Fairly well-known guy. He's dead now, unfortunately. I don't agree with him. Didn't agree with him a lot of things, but really good writer. A lot of things he wrote. He writes very well. But look at what he says. Basically, where do we come from? We're here because one odd group of fishes had a peculiar fin anatomy that transformed into legs for terrestrial creatures. Because the earth never froze entirely during an ice age, because a small and tenuous species arising in Africa 250,000 years ago has managed so far to survive by hook and by crook. We may yearn for a higher answer, but none exist. So when he says, what's the origins, what would he say? Well, how would he answer that question? Where did everything come from?
Nothing outside what's the physical world.
Very natural, and it's actually the result of just random chance. Basically, here's what he said: we're the result of rolling the dice. That's really what he's saying, right? Look at all the possibilities that just everything happened to kind of roll right. That's what he's saying. Your real purpose here, there really isn't one. You're just the result of natural chance, randomness that could have gone the other way. If the earth had frozen over. Now I'm an engineer, okay? And this is actually some of the things he's saying here are some of the things that I find to be the most obvious evidence that something special about our world, how our world was made. Water's a really good example. Do you know what's unusual about water compared to any other liquid, basically, that we know of? You know what's unusual?
When it freezes, it doesn't become heavier than the
Exactly
water.
right. Excellent. Water freezes and ice forms on the top. Every other liquid basically forms ice on the bottom first. And if the world's oceans froze from the bottom up, life couldn't live, especially in the ocean at least. Water's different. And what happens to be most of our earth? Water. Now, some people would go, well, that's just because we happen to be here. But I actually look at it as like, well, somebody made this that way specifically because he wanted us to live. And he wanted to create a place we could live at. Biblical theism origins took first and end of Genesis 1:131. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and so he created everything. We find in the middle he created man and woman in his likeness and his image. But then at the end he also said he also created everything good. He didn't create anything bad, is what it says. He created it all good. Now that has implications later when we talk about psychology and things, because we know there's bad things in the world. Okay, but originally it was not created that way. Where did everything come from? It was made good by an eternal creative God. Actually, if you read Genesis, you see all the things he made too. He has a creative bent, at least that's what I believe. And man's created because we're made in his image too, I believe. Now, let's look at naturalisms, some of the things a naturalist would say about meaning. Jean-Paul Sartre, I think is how you say his name, right? Is that how you say Sartre, I think? He's a French existentialist philosopher. Every existing thing is born without reason, prolongs itself out of weakness, and dies by chance. There's that roll the dice. Life has no meaning the moment you lose the illusion of being eternal. That's a pretty uplifting set of statements, isn't it? Right? Is that how you want to live? Well, that's what he thought the end meaning is. And I can tell you right now, there's a lot of people probably at our university that thinks he's a great guy. And he's someone you ought to read and learn from. I like to read him when I'm trying to think about how good we do have it. This guy Mencken, what the meaning of life may be, I don't know. I'm inclined to suspect that it has none. He doesn't know for sure, probably kind of agnostic. Now, I added Stephen Hawking here. Y'all know who he is, right? And he was famous. He's famous. He was in the news not too long ago because he said, absolutely what is he convinced of now? God does not exist. That's what he just came out with, is this absolute. This was in his younger youth, I guess. When I was young, I wanted to know how and why the universe. I now know the how, but not the why. Now he's made a more absolute statement that I don't know why, but it wasn't because of God. That's what he's saying now. Now, I actually added him in here for one reason. You can tell he's I don't know what word you want to use, disabled, handicapped, whatever you want to use for the word. Okay? Well, if you look at that, what we're going to see in a minute when we talk about the clash of worldviews, basically if you follow the end result of naturalism, he shouldn't be alive. He shouldn't be allowed to live. And yet he's a great mind. But he shouldn't be allowed to live because he's just a drain on the rest of society. So if you take his worldview to an extreme, he really shouldn't be existing, quite frankly. Okay, and I'll talk about that again later on. This is on a more practical level. This guy, Jose Martinez from 1988, in The Meaning of Life, he's a taxi driver. And look at what he said, but it's the same basic idea. We're here to die, just to live and die. I drive my cab, I do some fishing, take my girl out, pay taxes, do a little reading, then get ready to drop dead. Life is a big fake. Another uplifting kind of statement. But that's the practical man with a naturalist worldview. So what's the meaning and purpose of life in a naturalist worldview? There isn't any. There's no reason to have any hope. Why? Because you're only going to live a little while, you're going to die, go back to the dirt. In fact, that's one of the other things here in a minute I'll say about destiny. But look at what the biblical worldview is. This is Ephesians 2:10. For we are God's workmanship. And that word workmanship actually means masterpiece, like Da Vinci would paint a painting. You know, when we look at his paintings, go, wow, those are great. Well, that's what this is saying God sees us as. And so we were created in Jesus Christ to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. He created us with a plan, is what this says. Whether you believe it or not, it's what it's saying. He created you and me with a plan. From the very beginning, He knew He had a plan for us. So what's the meaning and purpose of life? To fulfill God's purposes for our lives. That would be the biblical worldview versus the naturalist that has no meaning. Naturalism's destiny. Y'all seen the movie Dead Poets Society? Y'all seen that? I like the movie. It's an interesting movie. You know, and Robin Williams, here's what he said: "We're food for worms, lads." What's he saying? Live for today, carpe diem or whatever. You know, live for today. Why? Because tomorrow we what? Die. So what's the end meaning and destiny? You're going right back to the dirt. Food for worms. Okay? So what happens after we die? Annihilation, kaput, no afterlife. You just go back to the dirt. Now, there's another interesting implication here, too. If you think about the destiny, there's really no ultimate meaning to history. History just kind of happens. There's nothing really kind of a sense logic in it. A Christian worldview has said there's some eternal destiny and history's leading up to that. But this kind of worldview, there's really not even a good way to interpret what history is, in a sense, if you really take it to the extreme. Biblical theism destiny. I like this quote. You know who C.S. Lewis is? You know who he is? I really like him. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal. It means they're not going to last forever. And their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it's immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. What he's saying here is we all have an eternal destiny. And we may be eternally horrors or eternally splendors. And what he's talking about is those that go to be with God versus those that don't. And the end result. And this is John 3:16 says too, "For God so loved the world, He gave His only begotten Son. Whoever believes in Him should not perish but have eternal life." The biblical worldview is we're eternal. Naturalism's identity. There's kind of two forms of this. They're both basically based in the same idea. Materialists consider humans are just this accidental roll-the-dice collection of molecules. Okay? A humanist believes the same thing, but they think man has evolved into this super great apex of everything. We're our own gods. We decide what's right, wrong, and so forth. They both believe it's an evolutionary type thing, but they're a little bit different result in their view of humans, in a sense. Yes, sir. What's a human being in naturalism? He might be he's a self-conscious animal, maybe superior than all other animals, but that's all we really are, is we're an animal, right? That's really the only thing you can conclude. What's special about us? There isn't anything. We don't have a spirit or a soul. We're just a collection of molecules that evolved into something a little more smart than other animals. Biblical theism, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but this is where that middle part of Genesis 1 where it says God created man and woman in His image, you know, in the image of God. And there's a famous painting, right? But this is something I think is really, I mean, again, whether you believe it or not, I just want you to see the contrast here, okay, whether you believe it's not. The image of God, the actual basic way the word that was used here in the old language it was written in, basically meant a royal term, and it basically meant that man was God's regent. We were His representatives on the world, created to serve Him in His image. He wanted us to be creative. He wanted us to, you know, it talks about be fruitful, multiply. It talks about subdue the earth. It wasn't that He wanted us to go out and beat everything into submission. He wanted us to form it and form civilizations, form institutions, create order out of the chaos like He did. He joined things together. Okay, that's what He was asking us to do. Not that we were God, but we're His representatives. There's really a lot in there. It's really the basis of human dignity. Each one of us is made in His image, so we have an inherent dignity, an inherent value. But if I'm just roll the dice dirt, you know, random what's my value? There ain't a whole lot, right? So, and this is another one. It says He made us a little bit higher than the angels. So what's a human being? We're a special creation of God in a biblical theistic worldview. Now, morals versus ethics. We talk a lot about moral values, but in reality, morals is actually based on the word more. You know what a more is? A more, what is it? I'm sorry. It's a custom or a cultural manifestation. It could be changing. It's not absolute. Ethics or ethos is that foundational absolutes that you live by. So actually moral values can change, but the ethics you live by are that foundational thing. Okay, so really we're really probably talking about more about ethical foundations that our morals come from. Okay, you could say it that way. Problem is, morals too can be very democratic. If 90% of the people think that that other 10% aren't worthy to live, hey, they're the majority, right? It's very democratic. They have no natural worth except for those people who carries the biggest stick, who can enforce the rule. Okay, that's really what the result you get. So ethics in a natural world, and this guy says it, who's to say what's right and what's wrong? It all depends on the situation. What's right for you might not be right for me. Situational ethics, relativism, or do I have enough buddies that agree with me that I can go make you do what I want? Or I decide whether you live or die because I got enough people that agree with me. That's what this leads to if you follow this. So who decides? It's relative to the human, and it's really decided by who has the force to enforce that idea, what's right and wrong. Now, this is as opposed to these other people, Francis Schaeffer and Lewis, they're just saying the same thing. Those who stand outside all judgment of value cannot have any ground for preferring one of their own impulses to another except the emotional strength of the impulse. What Lewis is saying here is exactly what naturalism says. You make your decisions basically based on your instinct, animal instinct. You're no different than another animal that just acts on his instinct. Now, the biblical view is you have a free will to choose whether you follow that instinct or not. But a naturalist view, you need a government or somebody to force you to act a certain way because you can't make that choice on your own. Or you need a group of people to tell you how to act and make you act that way because you don't have any innate knowledge of how to do that, or choice, if you will. Now, so this is interesting, this moral implications. This was a person said this, I don't determine right and wrong. Societies come up with what is right and wrong. See, that's who makes the rules, the societies, not some foundational set of principles. Antioch Christians, that's talking about a group of Christians in the Bible versus, some people would say in a good way, Nazi Germans in a bad way. Now here's what he's saying. Was Hitler wrong? I ask y'all that question. Was he wrong? No. Why not? If he following this point of view, he wasn't, right?
That's when we follow all time.
Yeah. How do we say he was wrong? That's what I'm getting at. If you follow this naturalistic viewpoint, how do you say he's wrong? Now, inherently, most of us would say he did wrong things, right? Well, why do you say that? Okay, that's what I'm trying to get at. You don't have a good way to judge if you don't have a foundation to say why it's wrong. Osama bin Laden. I guarantee you there's a lot of people around the world. We had the president of Iran here talking about basically all this happened because we did it ourselves, September 11th. But there's people who go, Osama bin Laden wasn't wrong. There's a lot of other people who said he was to send somebody to kill 3,000 people. But who decides? Who makes those rules? Yes, sir.
Didn't you just say who got the biggest stick?
Well, that's what I'm getting at. That's how those rules, that's how the result of that comes out, is who has the biggest stick. Some people will tell you history's written by the winners, right? That's another way to say that, right? What I'm saying is that's not true. I'm saying the answer to that, I'm saying it's true in some ways because they're following a naturalistic viewpoint. I'm not saying it's absolute truth because that's not what the biblical viewpoint would be. Hitler was absolutely wrong by going out and killing handicapped people. The Bible would say he did. They had inherent worth. I'm just saying that's what the biblical view would say. I'm not saying people followed it. I'm just saying that is what it would say. It's a distinction from what he followed. So basically, when you measure something, what you use as a standard, think of a yardstick, okay? A yardstick has inches on it, for example. And basically, now we can get into, since we're at a college, we can get into, well, what if you're traveling near the speed of light and all this other stuff, right? But we're in the room, we're not traveling the speed of light. Somebody told me that, one of our high school kids told me this. And I was like, okay, smart guy, we're not traveling the speed of light, okay? And I take this yardstick and I measure a height. Well, an inch is going to be an inch, right? It doesn't matter if I feel good about it being an inch or not, right? It's an inch. It's objective. And it's also an absolute standard, right? An inch is an inch. Well, see, that's basically what I'm proposing that a biblical view says about God's laws. They're absolute. They're not dependent on how I feel. It's the way they are. Whether I follow them or not or agree with them, that's what they are. It's an absolute standard. Naturalism standard is, how do I feel? Is it this group that has the power to enforce that feeling or that law? It's not absolute. That's kind of what I'm trying to get at here. What you end up with is that in a naturalist view, you end up with things that are really just preferences. I want it to be this way, or I like it to be this way, not that this is how it actually is. That's what you have to be careful about. I'm going to go ahead and go through this real quick. Matter of character. Here's what I want to do to finish up. I'm going too long, Patrick, I know.
Okay.
You can talk to most students in my class and they'll see that too. So I want to compare, just in this question of what is a person, I want to compare naturalism and a biblical theism and see what the end result of being consistently naturalistic, where you're going to get at and where we're going toward if we keep that worldview. Okay? Naturalism is man is at best a superior animal. Biblical theism, man is a special creation of God with dignity, value, and purpose. I'm not saying even people that claim to be Christians live this way all the time. That's not what I'm saying. But it is what the Bible says. Okay? So, now, are we just another animal? Do you know who Peter Singer is? You heard of him? He's a Princeton ethicist. He's considered one of the leading, if you will, bioethicists in the country. Okay, and I'm going to use a lot of his statements because I think he's the classic example of naturalism gone to the end result. Okay, look at what he says. We can no longer base our ethics, our foundational beliefs, on the idea that human beings are a special form of creation, singled out from all other animals and alone possessing an immortal soul. Once the religious mumbo-jumbo has been stripped away, we may continue to see normal members of our species as possessing greater capacities, they're smarter or less, than members of any other species, but we will not regard as sacrosanct the life of each and every member of our species. Species membership alone, being a human, is not morally relevant. Being a part of the human species is not morally, doesn't mean anything. That's what he's saying. Sanctity of life. Look at what he was writing this in, too. Pediatrics, what's that about? Children. He's saying this actually about children. You'll see in a minute what he's saying here. So how do we judge the values of animals? What they can do for me, right? They can work for me. They might be tasty. Okay? How do I judge a human animal? Now, we don't tend to eat them. We're not cannibals in most cases, even though some cultures are, right? But we tend to look at them as what? What can they do for me? What is the value to me? What are the value to society? Sounds like how we look at animals, right? What's their value? Not because they're human, but because they have some value. Or how they look. Think about this. Save the baby seals. Why do you think they use baby seals? Because of why? They're cute. They look great. But see, you don't see this. You don't see save the adult seals because they're ugly. You don't see you might, but you don't see the winner of Miss America is not some, 53-year-old lady. I mean, there may be some really nice looking 53-year-old ladies, but in general, right? See what I'm getting at? It's based on what they look like. Just like we judge animals. You very seldom, not always, most people don't pick ugly pets. They pick cute and cuddly pets. And what they do for them, they make me feel good. Okay, is that how we judge humans? In some ways it is, right? How we judge our friends and stuff. And so this is what was being talked about a minute ago. This idea is called something a circle of empathy. Or it's also called sympathy or allegiance. Really, anything in the circle I treat like a person, anything outside I don't. So right off the bat, who's at the center of the circle? Me, you, you got your own circle, right? Me. Now, who else do we add in? I like my family. They're part of the circle. I like my friends. They're in the circle. They're in the club. This is a worker. What I'm actually talking about here is at one point we fought a war to decide that people that were black were human, basically, or as human as the rest of us. And we fought a war over that they belonged in the circle. That they weren't three-fifths of a human, whatever it was, 3/5, I think, of a human. And it took a war to decide that, okay? So we put them in the circle. And for a long time, we kept people that were disabled and the unborn in that circle. But then people started saying, okay, what about pets and other life forms, amoebas? What about them? Are they persons? Do they belong in the human circle? Well, nowadays, what about trees? Do they belong in the personhood, that they're valued like a person? Now, think about this. In today's society, what's the answer?
Save the trees.
Save the trees, save the animals. Here's what we've done. We've shifted the circle and in some cases expanded it. But look at what's happening. We've added pets maybe in some ways. It's more important to save this animal than a human. And look at what ends up happening. Look who gets left out. They're not persons anymore. Okay? We've shifted the definition in a way that it's left out what we would have called a person before, and it's even gotten worse. We're even like this in many ways. And so look who's getting left out. Save the trees, save the pets. Who cares about the unborn baby? And if they're an invalid, they shouldn't live. They're not valuable to society. So here's what's happened. What some people would go is saying, oh, we're valuing life by making this circle bigger. But what you're actually doing is you're devaluing humans. You're making some humanity less valuable than another. That's what you're doing. So expanding or shifting these circles and saying something's morally equivalent ends up actually putting a price on a human in a way that it devalues other humans. That's really what you're doing. Once you try to put a price on humanity, you've devalued it. That's really what you're saying. Once I try to put a price on it, I've actually devalued it. Now, this is a guy, I like this book. You ought to read this. He's not a Christian, but he's a very interesting author. They say he's one of the fathers of virtual reality. And he wrote this book fairly recent, within the last year or so, You're Not a Gadget. Okay, and what he's fighting against is there's a group of people that think, it's actually these guys that think eventually our consciousness is kind of just going to go into software and we're just going to be these human computer type things in eternity. And he thinks we've lost something of fundamental humanity. It's really interesting. He thinks we've lost this nature of humanity, but he doesn't believe in God. So I think he actually has an inconsistent result because he has no reason to base what he's saying on. He knows it seems right, but he doesn't really have a reason to base it. Look at what he says. I spend my time with various species and decide if they feel like they're in my circle or not. Chickens are feathery, servo-controlled mechanisms. He's an engineer. I eat them. They're little feathery servo-controlled mechanisms. I eat them. But compared to goats, I do not eat them. For some reason he likes goats better. I don't know why. He doesn't eat them. We all live with our imperfect ability to discern the proper boundaries of our circles of empathy. The borders of personhood remain variegated and fuzzy. He's saying not everybody belongs in there. Not humans belong in those circles. And look at what he says. This is what he actually looks like. He's older than me. Look at this guy. I thought about that. I don't know if my wife will like that, but I may grow my hair like that when I get older. But
No, please continue watching.
But it's really an interesting. I really like the things he says because I think he's saying the right thing in many ways. But then he doesn't really have a good basis to say why that's right because he doesn't really believe in God. And I think it's interesting. It's hard to decide where to place faith in personhood because a proposed being, while it might be deserving of empathy, cannot speak for itself. Now, next Monday, we're going to hear about humans that can't speak for themselves, unborn babies. That's what we're going to hear about. They don't have a voice. These are exactly the situations that must be left to people close to the situation because we'll ruin personal freedom by enforcing a metaphysical idea on one another. Okay, now we're going to have a discussion next week about abortion. But here's my question. Who speaks for that unborn baby? Who does speak for him?
Society.
I would say God does. I'd say God's who says that unborn baby has worth. So the question is, do you believe in God or not? Society, it's just, do we feel that way right now? I understand what you're saying. They can speak for it if they believe in God and believe there is a worth or a value there. But I'd say that's the voice, is God. What did he say about him? And that's actually, this is a guy that's very interesting. He's a MIT guy, and what he's talking about is, I study humans, and I think of them as like these computers. He's a computer guy. I think of humans are just these biological machines, but then I go home and see my kids, and I think, these aren't machines. And he's like conflicted, because he really wants to believe in this kind of naturalistic, but then he realizes it doesn't make sense in how he actually acts. He's got an inconsistent viewpoint. Implications about abortion. The question really here is the personhood. Let me show you what I mean. This is John Kerry when he was running in 2004 against President Bush. And look at what he says. Life begins at a conception. In the womb, he's saying that's life, that's human life. But the fetus is not the form of life that takes on personhood as we've defined it. The argument now is not whether it's human life, it's whether that human life deserves to live. That's the argument that's being made here. Are they a person? Not that they're human, but is that worthy of personhood? That's what he's saying. Now I'll show you this. This is an ultrasound of a friend of ours at church. This is what she looks like now, Kinsley. Okay? That's not a person. That is a person. I would have told you that's a person right there because I see her right there. And she's moving around. She's a person. Okay? She may be dependent on her mama, but a lot of us are dependent on somebody else. Right? Right? She's a cute little girl, isn't she? And this is what the Bible says. You created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. You saw me before my body was even formed. You had a plan for my life. before I was even formed. You knew you had a plan for me. That's the biblical worldview. This is interesting, this movie Gattaca, I don't know if you ever saw this. Ethan Hawke, you know who that is? He's an actor, and Uma Thurman. What it's interesting here, what happened in this book, this future society, is what they did there is they do genetic testing, and the ones that were genetically flawed, they would be aborted, and look at what they called them, invalids. Put it together, invalids. That's what they were aborting. And it was even things like nearsightedness and stuff. It wasn't just like they were going to have some horrible genetic defect they couldn't see. And you think that's fun, or not funny, sorry, I don't mean that. You think that seems out extreme. In Britain, there's something called squint. You know what squint is? You're born and you have a kind of lazy eye or something. And what do they do nowadays? They can put a patch, they can do surgery. But you know what they do here? They tell you to abort the baby. And there's a lot of people do it. Because the person has a lazy eye that could be fixed. And they go, well, we don't want to go through all that, we'll abort it. So this is where we're going. It's not, we're not even talking about serious genetic defects, if you want to use that as an argument. We're talking about simple things. Human commodities, embryos, embryonic stem cells, big topic right now. Was very hot during President Bush's time. Okay? Here's the lady from Colorado who voted to ease restrictions that was then vetoed by President Bush. For many, embryonic stem cell research is the most promising source of potential treatments and cures for this debilitating disease. You know the big spokesperson for this? You know who was the big Superman? What's his name? Played Superman. Christopher Reeve, right? In a wheelchair. He broke his neck, and he was a big proponent of this. Here's the problem with this. Can y'all tell me any cures that have come out of embryonic stem cell research?
Not yet.
Zero. Where they have had some indications of cures out of what? Adult stem cells, not embryonic, adult, where you're not killing an embryo. There has been some potential for a cure, okay? And President Bush, what he did is I vetoed it because I felt it crossed a moral line that I and many others find troubling. What she's going, oh, you're crazy. We can sacrifice the weak for others, is what she's saying. Here's our friend Peter Singer. The argument that a fetus is not alive is a resort to the convenient fiction that turns an evidently living being into one that is legally not alive. He's arguing it is alive. He's saying, I'm not saying a fetus, an unborn baby is not alive. Instead of accepting this fiction, we should recognize the fact that a being is human and alive does not in itself tell us whether it's right or wrong to take that being's life. He's saying it even's a human. But does that make it morally wrong to kill it? So here's the implications of that. Euthanasia. Y'all may not remember Terry Schiavo, probably you do. We pulled her tube. We basically let her starve to death, is what we did by pulling that. I say we because our society allowed it to happen. Okay? And you look at that and say, well, she was in this vegetative state, maybe. But look at this guy, Ronald Cranford. He thinks even a person that was in an electric wheelchair the guy can operate ought to be denied food and water because he's a drain on society. Here's the outcome of this mindset. Now we're gone to adults. Handicapped adults. This is what our friend Peter Singer says. Not everything the Nazis did was horrendous. We cannot condemn euthanasia just because the Nazis did it. But the question is, was it right or wrong? Just because the Nazis did it. But he's kind of like going, there's not really anything wrong. I'll show you why. Thanks, son, is what I say this. This is from a New York Times interview with Peter Singer. He's talking about his mother. He has a sister, too. Singer's mother suffers from severe Alzheimer's. She's since died, I think. So she's no longer qualifies as a person by his own standards, yet he spends considerable sums on her care. This apparent contradiction of his principles is not gone unnoticed by the media. When I asked him about it during our interview at his Manhattan apartment in late July, he sighed and explained that he's not the only person involved in making decisions about his mother. He has a sister. Now look at what he says. He did say that if he were solely responsible, his mother might not be alive today. He wouldn't have taken care of her because she's not of value to society. His own mother. This is the end result of this kind of mindset. You have no inherent dignity. Why should somebody, if they don't have worth to society, let's kill them. Okay? I'm going to tell you, it gets even worse. This is the worst one to me. Okay? Human babies are not born self-aware. Born self-aware. We're talking about a baby out of the womb here. Okay? Human babies are not born self-aware or capable of grasping their lives over time. They are not persons. My little friend Kinsley, few pages before, isn't a person, okay? Hence, their lives would be seen no more worthy of protection than the life of a fetus. We may not want a child. Listen to the wording he uses here. We may not want a child to start on life's uncertain voyage if the prospects are clouded. When this can be known at a very early stage in the voyage, we may still have a chance to make a fresh start. This means detaching ourselves from the infant who has been born, cutting ourselves free before the ties have already begun to bind us to our child and have become irresistible. Instead of going forward and putting all our effort into making the best of the situation, we can still say no and start again.
This is so written by a man.
Well, you know what he's talking about here? He's talking about babies. You know what kind?
Infants.
Babies with Down syndrome. That's what he's talking about. Okay? I don't know if y'all know anybody like that. We have a young lady in our church, sweetest girl I've ever seen. There's a reason for people like that. I'm telling you, if nothing else, it helps us know what true, specialness is. Yes?
I'm not sure if it was in the same writing, but he's also said that one way to define a human or a person is a lot of times people will use the argument of when they can start speaking.
That's
like
this self-aware or whatever. I mean, I tell you what, my kids were sitting there blabbering at me really early, and they were saying something. I don't know what it was. Yes, sir.
But he was saying, well, a parrot can jabber off some stuff. Does that make the parrot self-aware?
Self-aware, yeah. I mean, you can mimic, right? But my point is, look at what he's saying. And there's a train of thought. There's a follower of him, a person that says you can go all the way up to 3 years old, and it's okay. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm nowhere close ready to say that that's not a person. No way. It has to be. And yet there's people, and this is a seriously respected person. That's what I'm trying to say. This is where we're at in our world, our society. What's wrong with the world? A guy named G.K. Chesterton was asked by a newspaper. You know what he said? Dear sirs, I am. Sincerely yours, G.K. Chesterton. We're what's wrong with the world. Fallen man, according to the Bible. That's why everything was good, and then we had the original sin, and we followed right along with our moms and dads and become sinners too. We've chosen to disobey the foundational rules. I'm going to skip ahead real quick. Basically what we need is this fixed point. Our law should have a fixed point, a reference point, okay? And that's based on I think, biblical principles. It's not saying we're running the world like a theocracy. That's not what I'm saying. But this underlying principle of the dignity and value of human life is very foundational to everything. And in fact, if you go to what our founders said, it can be everybody know who Patrick Henry is? Cannot be emphasized too strongly or too often that this great nation was founded not by religionists, but by Christians, not on religions, but on the gospel of Jesus Christ. And look at why he says this was good. Now, I'm not saying we did everything perfect. That's not what I'm saying. For this is the very reason peoples of other faiths have been afforded asylum, prosperity, and freedom of worship here, which they didn't have other places, because of our Christian principles. That's why they had. I'm not saying everybody did it perfect. That's not what I'm saying, or we do it perfect today. But the only reason we had most of this is because it was founded on those principles. John Quincy Adams, the highest glory of the American Revolution was this: it connected in one indissoluble bond the principles of civil government and the principles of Christianity. That's our founding fathers. And this is an interesting one from the most recent last slide. Harry S. Truman, who I think was a Democrat, right? Wasn't Truman a Democrat? Yeah. Not a Republican, he's a Democrat. There's Christian Democrats too, Christian Republicans, non-Christian both. The fundamental basis of the nation's law was given to Moses on the Mount. The fundamental basis of our Bill of Rights comes from the teachings we get from Exodus and St. Matthew, from Isaiah and St. Paul. I don't think we emphasize that enough these days. Now look at what he says. This is in 50-something, I guess. If we don't have a proper fundamental moral background, we will finally wind up with a totalitarian government which does not believe in rights for anybody except the state. We have a problem right now that we have a government, and I'm not saying it's just a Democrat problem. I think it's a political elite problem that says the Constitution tells you what rights we have versus the Constitution tells you what limits there are on the government. That's the difference. And so that's where we can go if we're not careful. Yes, sir. In fact, I would propose to you right now, Jerry Falwell and the moral majority, and I probably at the time thought this was a great idea, but the more I realize, the link of Christians too strongly with the government is a bad idea, because the government ends up being your God. What happens? That's who you turn to for power instead of to God. So now, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. That's true, but I'm not saying it's just because he was a Republican. There was a bunch of abolitionists that were Christians is what helped do a lot of what was done to remove slavery. William Wilberforce in Great Britain died, basically gave his life fighting the slave trade. If you haven't ever read about him, he did a lot of things to make society better, but he did it because he was a Christian. And he served as a politician as a Christian because he knew that gave him God had put him there for that reason, not to have the power, but to have the ability to influence the world. That's the movie, is Amazing Grace. And what I'm arguing here is one of those foundational things is the human dignity in life is a foundational thing. That's what I'm arguing. And that we've gotten away from that. We've gone to a viewpoint that's basically a naturalistic viewpoint that your value is judged by what value you are to society. And we can argue about all other kinds of economic principles and stuff too. Yeah. But if we don't have that basic same foundational belief in life, a lot of the other stuff doesn't really matter, actually, right? I mean, it really doesn't in a sense, if you don't have the same basic belief of life. I mean, you take, again, I'm not saying we've done everything perfect. That's not what I'm trying to argue here at all. But you look and say we have inalienable rights given by God. Well, as opposed to the state says what rights you have, no. God says what rights I have, at least foundationally of life, and then we make laws.